so wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces this afternoon here at the CES. So I'm Jayne Morrow. I serve as a senior advisor to the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I'm here today to help facilitate a panel discussion around how we can grow the number of women in STEM and standards development process. So many of you may or may not be familiar with standards. So I get to start with a little discussion about the number of women in standards and why it's so important to us. So women make up a third of the STEM professional fields. That is a statistic that we're trying desperately to grow around the world. And why is it important to us that we grow the number of women in STEM fields? Well, women are critical to many of our economic decisions. They are making daily decisions based on products and product design. They are leading industry, organizations, and they are leading government agencies and academic research institutions. We need to grow the number of women, and we need to grow their engagement in standards. So another statistic that you may not be familiar with is that standards underpin 93% of global trade. Standards factor into all aspects of our life and our society and the way that we do business. And today we're going to talk about some of the critical roles that women, in increasing the number of women, can have on standards development process and STEM fields. So it's such an honor to get to serve as a moderator for this prestigious panel. And I get to introduce the panel members. And we're going to start with my colleague here, Sonya Bird, who is the Vice President and International Standards at the Underwriter Laboratory. And next we'll have Denice Durrant, who's in Engineering and Data Science at UL. And last, Veronica Lancaster, who's the Vice President for Standards Programs here at CTA. So join me in welcoming everyone to this conversation. Thank you. So I'd like to just start, if you would please introduce yourself, share a little about your background and how you chose the STEM field and your opportunity to work in standards development.
Yeah, thank you, Jayne. So I actually kind of lucked into the world of standards. I was always really strong in science and math growing up, and luckily for me, I was one of 4 girls. I had 3 sisters, and I did a lot of work with my dad, doing projects with him. And when I was thinking about a traditional field of teaching, he said, Sonya, you need to think a little bit outside of traditional fields for women, and helped me consider some other opportunities. And I ended up in electrical engineering and was lucky enough when I was graduating to apply for a job that wanted an engineer with good writing skills. And I thought that was a great match. And so 34 years later, I've been involved in lots of different types of standards development for UL Standards and Engagement, which is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to safety, and it's our safety mission around the world.
And my name is Denice Durrant, and again, I work for UL Standards and Engagement. And the way that I got introduced to STEM is because I was the typical kid who broke everything in the household. And my dad and I would fix them together. So my dad is an engineer, my sister is an engineer. I had great examples growing up of what engineering looked like and what it could look like as a career. But as an opinionated, teenager, I thought that I was going to go to school, study engineering, and then become a patent attorney because I saw it on Law and Order. But I was so happy with what I was learning in my engineering classes. I was happy with the experience that I had. I thought my internships were great. So I ended up going back to school because I also learned that if you got an engineering degree, you were probably going to end up in a factory or a manufacturing facility. So I ended up going to grad school. I started working in R&D, and one of the things about R&D is that safety is typically not really, focused on. And so I had a significant interest in how do we make our research safer, and then how can I translate the research that I'm doing in this lab into a career. And so I started off as a product safety engineer at UL Solutions. I became really interested in standards because one thing that I also noticed is when it's time to certify a product, if you don't have a relevant standard, if you don't have a standard that's representative of truly what you're trying to address from a safety standpoint, then what exactly are you doing? So I had the opportunity to come to UL Standards and Engagement about 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, and I've loved it ever since. So that has been my kind of journey in STEM.
I love that you mentioned law. So my name is Veronica Lancaster. I'm Vice President of Standards and Technology at CTA. I'm also the president of the U.S. National Committee of the IEC, which is really dedicated to building international standards. And I really got my start in business administration, but I also was really into law. And we could talk about law and order forever, I'm sure. But anyway, standards has an interesting sort of connection, right? Because we're setting the rules and procedures, and law can have that same type of feel. And the way that I got my start was really, I thought I was going down this training and development, business administration path, but I went to work for a standards development organization and fell in love. So more than 20 years later, I am still involved in it, and it's definitely a career for life. I think there's so much that we can do as women, and I know we're going to get into that here, but really the reason why it's important to grow STEM and women and better diversity in the engineering field and in standardization is that we really need our voices there to talk about how those products are important to us. So I can't wait to get into it.
Well, thank you, ladies. It's so fantastic hearing your stories and journey to get to STEM fields and to be able to demonstrate impact and work in the standards community as part of that impact. So the next question I would like to pose to each of you is, what does the impact of a lack of women in STEM fields mean for both standards development as well as design and process and product development? Excuse me. And so next I'd like to start with Sonya.
Thank you. So I've been involved, as Veronica has, in the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, which is dedicated to international standards around electrotechnical products. And one of the things that I had the opportunity to really get involved in was an IEC Council Board Task Force on Diversity. And we realized that women were very sorely underrepresented at all levels of the IEC, from the management groups to the technical committees. And as a result of that, one of the things we've learned is that women, by not being at the table, have neglected to help drive standards development. And having those women's voices at the table is so important. We worked at the IEC along with ISO, another international body, on developing guidance for gender-responsive standards. One of the things that we realized was that technical committees just simply weren't thinking about the fact that a product designed to a standard under that technical committee, or a process perhaps, hasn't considered all of the aspects of women in addition to men. And so that was, I think, a learning point for us, is to recognize that standards, without having women at the table, may not address all of the safety needs that need to be considered. And we have a couple of good examples around that, around where some of these standards perhaps fell short. And a few examples that we've heard over the years, I'll share one, I think Veronica may share another, is around bulletproof vests, as an example. So you think about a woman's shape, and if you have a bulletproof vest that protects at one part of her body, it may leave a gap where a bullet could get in. And that's something that needs to be considered. Or what are some of the size differences, some of the hormonal differences? Women hear things differently. We know that there are some differences around peripheral vision between men and women. And so this is a lot of what we discovered early on with that group, is the need to make sure that we are including women at the table so that those other differences can be considered.
I'll just jump right in on where Sonya just left off. So she mentioned we've been friends for a long time and we participate in standards development together, but throughout our time, especially since 2020, we've talked about the female crash test dummy. This should, for all the ladies out there, this should really shock you in that the standard is based on male anatomy. In fact, there is only one car developer as of maybe a month ago that tests using the female crash dummy, and that's Volvo. Every other car you're buying in the US does not test with a female crash test dummy because it's not the standard. So when you get into a car crash, women are 73% more likely to be seriously injured or killed because they're using male crash test dummies. And I think it's they use a scaled down version of a male crash test dummy to represent the female, but it really is only representative of maybe the smallest 5% of the population. It's basically the equivalent of a 12 or 13-year-old boy. So think about that when you get in your cars, when your wives get in their cars, when our daughters get in their cars. They're not as protected as men are because we weren't at the table when those standards are being developed. That's really why we need to be there and change that.
And I think what Sonya and Veronica have pointed out is that the impact is if you don't have perspective at the table, it's very difficult to ensure that a standard is actually addressing a plethora of opportunities to address, how we all are safe and how we all interact with different products. And with new and emerging products, that's important because we don't want to introduce innovation into an environment where we haven't considered all of the different ramifications.
These are excellent examples and so important for all of us to consider how to increase diversity and inclusion at the standards table. So my next question is, what are you and your organizations doing to enhance inclusivity in standards development process? And I would like to go with Veronica to start, please.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about this. I could probably talk about this for an hour if you let me. Diversity is really important to me personally. I think throughout my career, I've built a network of really amazing women that I not only enjoy being friends with, but I love working with. I love creating solutions with. And throughout my career, I've been lucky enough to have a network of women that we've worked together, and in some cases, we've changed to different companies. So for me personally, it's been successful in that within CTA, in our technology and standards department, we are 60% women, 40% men, which I love. And I believe CTA as an organization is maybe 2/3 women, but I don't have the exact stat. I just think what I think is important about mentoring and succession planning and keeping that network of contacts available, that's really a key to improving diversity. And I think as we're succession planning and mentoring, we have to look for that next great person that will hopefully pick up and carry when you go. I feel very comfortable when I'm ready to retire that my team will continue the good fight. So I think that's a key.
And I'll jump in because one of the things that I'd like to share with this audience today is that as of today, UL Standards and Engagement has shared and made a public announcement that we are specifically tackling inclusive terminology in our portfolio. So right now we have over 1,700 standards and documents in our portfolio. So not just standards, but also test methodologies, guidance documents. Across that portfolio, what we identified is, close your ears, David, but we have over 650 standards where we need to address the fact that the language may be offensive or it may not be, conducive to interpretation. And that interpretation could be in other languages. It could also be interpretations across cultures and backgrounds. So 650 documents, that's a huge undertaking, and we want to do that by 2030. And that's just one of the initiatives that we have at UL Standards and Engagement, where we're truly focused on ensuring that safety is inclusive and safety is holistic.
And then another thing that UL Standards and Engagement did was to sign the UNECE Declaration on Gender Responsive Standards. And I know many standards development organizations did that, but we signed that in the year 2022. Since then, we've developed a gender action plan to help make sure that we are really putting the efforts behind the words. We're looking to increase diversity on our technical committees. We are looking to encourage the technical committees to think about gender when they're developing standards. We really want to be seen as an organization that's developing standards that address the needs of all, and that's Gender Action Plan is a great step in that direction.
These are all just fantastic ideas. And my
I
next
have one more for you. So just to jump onto what you were saying there, actually, I want to give a shout out to the IEC, but they have a guide document on gender responsive standards. So if you're working in standards or if you're trying to figure out what's the inclusive language, go to the IEC website, iec.ch, and download that document. It'll give you all the guidance you need. So that way you're being inclusive as well. So anyway, IEC, go IEC.
Thanks, Veronica. So these ideas are fantastic, and one of the things that we practice at NIST, the government agency that I work in, is opportunities to bring young people into the organization, experience the science, have an opportunity to work at the bench and learn from another engineer or scientist and get exposure into that science early and often. And so my next question is to really challenge you to give us some ideas around both recruitment and retention. So thinking at the beginning of that pipeline, or perhaps we used to call it the super highway, so that women that left STEM fields could come back in at any point during their careers, to all the way, how do we keep them? And what ideas do you have for that discussion?
And I can start. What I'll say is, from a retention standpoint, I know we always start with recruitment, but when we talk about retention, I think that's just as important as recruitment, because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of effort that goes into recruitment. But what happens when we recruit more women? What happens when we get them at the table, but we don't support them? And so I think that's an important step that we need to take. You know, how do we ensure that the women who can influence the standards and documents that we develop are supported, and they have the resources necessary to influence the work that we do? And I'll say, from a recruitment standpoint, you know, the area that I love to work in is K-12 outreach. So I participate in an organization right now where we go out to different elementary schools, because we know in the U.S., if children don't take Algebra 1, it used to be, when I was in school, it used to be by the 6th grade. But if you don't take Algebra 1 in the U.S. by the 5th grade, you are not on track to pursue a STEM field at a 4-year university. And that's alarming, because in most cases, most kids don't know that. Most parents don't know that. My mom knew it because she was that involved. But for those that don't know that, how can we ensure that the next generation, the next couple of generations, have what they need? And so I love to go to elementary schools. We make peanut butter, we make lip balm. I'm teaching them college-level chemistry at an early age so that they can understand what their career could look like. My husband, he goes out to high schools. He shows them how to code. And when I came to CES, this is my first year at CES, there's a whole exhibit hall focused on gaming. And so I took a couple of pictures for him to show some of his students, because this is something that they could aspire to, and that's what, you know, recruitment is all about.
Yeah, and I love it. You saw that and took pictures and for CES, but I hope it's not your last. Yeah, I agree with you. I do think you have to start very young, and I think when it comes to recruitment and retention, especially to improve gender, always, it's important for companies to think about the benefits to get you in the door. But once you're in the door, how do we keep you there? And an interesting example we talked about earlier, and I'll bring it up because it's also relatable. You know, we are all human beings. We all have to go to the bathroom. And there's always toilet paper in the public bathroom. However, the rest of us that are female, there are no feminine products in there, but that is for sure something that we're going to have to deal with at every point. And interestingly enough, we saw one of the bathrooms here still had one of the old coin slots, which you don't have coins anymore. But that's part of the environment, making the environment inclusive for women, understanding that if you want to keep them there, make it a place that they want to be at, right? So And networking is a huge part of that, making sure that you're really touching in and you're mentoring those next, great scientists, great engineers that will change the world. If you're a little tiny part of their journey and they continue and they do something great, I mean, that's something powerful. So I think that's a huge thing to consider. We do need to think about being more inclusive for women in the workplace.
And I think for me, I know a lot has changed since I first got involved in standards development all those years ago. But one of the things that's really made me stay there is the feeling of community. And I think that it helps when we have those small communities to support each other and to encourage each other and to bounce ideas off of each other. And one of the things that Veronica and I have mentioned the IEC a few times already, the U.S. hosted the IEC general meeting in 2022 in San Francisco. One of the things that we wanted to do was recognize the women who were there at that event. The percentage was, 10%, 15% women compared to the men who were there. And we got sponsors, put on a lunch, and brought all of those women and allies of women together to talk about how we can, as a community, continue to recruit women into these technical committees and keep them engaged. And it was really just so exciting to see these women from countries all over the world who felt like they belonged. And we heard story after story from the women who were there telling us about how they've been in a technical committee and been the only female, and how they felt so part of the community at that lunch with us. And since then, we continue to hear stories about how important that event was. And that's something that I think we'll continue to look for opportunities to do in the future.
Definitely. We'll definitely have to do that again.
And I want to just follow that. If you could share an experience or an example in which mentoring or networking has really had a pivotal impact in your career. I know this wasn't one of our prep questions, but it's clearly a way to influence and have powerful impact in each other's lives. So if any one of you would like to volunteer an example.
I'll jump in. Okay. So actually, within the IEC, it was very impactful for me. When I first started in the IEC, I think I was one of maybe 4 women that participated in this technical committee. And each of us, we gravitated toward each other. And we were a little bit nervous to speak up. And there are lots of management studies that could show you the differences in confidence that women have versus what men have, and how generally we tend to be a little bit more reserved at first. However, this small group, the more we supported each other, talked about challenges, the more confidence we gained, and the bigger our group got. So then we started having dinners once every 6 months, so we could continue to foster that network. And shortly thereafter, the 4 original women, one is now a chair of that technical committee, one is the head of her delegation from China, one is also a chair of an advisory group on strategy, and now I'm president of the U.S. National Committee. So we've supported each other's growth and journey, and it's all just slightly through building that confidence, right, and making sure we're supporting each other. It's so important.
Exactly what you said. It's so important because I think we can all relate to being the only one in some type of space. And I think being the only one resonates not only with being a woman, but also having like a certain level of expertise. And for me, I don't have a traditional engineering background, like where most people that come to UL are electrical engineers or mechanical engineers. My bachelor's and master's degrees were in chemical engineering and material science. And what that meant was I was the only one with that background amongst a bunch of electrical and mechanical engineers. And exactly. But what I will say is it caused me to have to think twice about every decision that I made because I wasn't comfortable at first, stepping out and saying, hey, we should probably look at this because we're so focused on like the electrical system. Or we probably shouldn't focus on this because we're so focused on the mechanical hazards. And it took time, but one of the best mentors that I had was while I was at UL as a product safety engineer, and he would always say in meetings, Denice, I want to get your perspective. And I really appreciated that because it allowed me the opportunity to, influence the conversation, influence the decisions that we were making. So from a mentoring standpoint, it doesn't always have to be formal. It can be as informal as making sure that the people who are in the room, the people who are, engaged in the discussion or the project, truly feel heard. And to me, that's one of the things that I'll never forget.
And I think rather than giving a mentoring example, I'd actually like to build on that, if that's okay. I think it's important for all of us to consider diversity across the board. We're talking today about women and engaging women in standards development and technical committees. But really, as Denice just mentioned, diversity can come in all forms. And in the case that she's talking about coming from a different technical background. I know for us at UL Standards and Engagement, one of the things we want to do on our technical committees is really make sure that we have a good diversity of participation. And I think with all of us, we can encourage not only the recruitment of technical committee members, but also encourage, again, that community feel and reaching out to anyone who's new on a committee and making them feel comfortable.
I'd love to build on what you just said, because I think another reason why this is so important, and I want to pull up the numbers, this is also another shocking stat for you, but the reason it's important for us to not only build STEM as far as, standardization and engineering, women have such a huge purchasing power. In fact, for all the ladies in the audience here, how many of you make all of the purchasing decisions in your home? Like you buy your groceries, you pay the bills, you do, right. And now, here's the thing. Not anymore? Well, here's the thing. So according to Harvard Business Review, women are directly or indirectly responsible for 72.8% of spending in the U.S. Now, worldwide, it's even bigger. Women make 85% of all the purchasing decisions, and they currently control $20 billion with a B, in annual spending. So that is why we should all, as women, demand that these standards meet our needs. We should be demanding that our American car companies are using female crash test dummies. We should be at those tables writing those standards and making sure our perspectives are heard, like you said. So I think that's an important factor. Remember that, billion with a B.
I love how data intensive this group is. It's fantastic. So one of the questions that I would like to spend a little bit of time on, since we do have time, is to consider the implications of bias in data and these data streams. We're seeing technologies that are going to shape our society, and all of these technologies are dependent on data and data streams. So in terms of your understanding of some of the challenges around bias and how we collect data and test and evaluate products, what are some of the ideas or concerns that you have around bias in these data streams?
So I'm happy to jump in first. I mentioned earlier the joint group that IEC and ISO worked on together to develop guidance for gender-responsive standards. And one big piece of that guidance is the need for sex-disaggregated data. It doesn't exist in many cases, and that was one of the comments that came forth from that group. And I think what we can do, though, is always look for ways to at least think about the differences that might exist if we had that data. We don't want to base decisions on an average population. We want to base decisions on the best technical information that we have. And I'll just share a standard that UL Standards and Engagement published a year or so ago, is one on, it's 3741 for those that want to look it up later. It's a standard for PV hazard control, and it basically addresses firefighters that might be dealing with the fire with the photovoltaics. And we did, in that case, manage to get data that talks about how men and women react to currents differently. And as a result, when we published that standard, we actually had a lower threshold of shock in there than if we had only considered data for men. And to me, that's a big success, and that shows exactly why we need to have strong data when we can get our hands on it.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, strong data plays an important role in what requirements get embedded into a standard. And so one of the things that our data science and engineering team at UL Standards and Engagement is looking into is how incident data plays a role in data collection from the standpoint of understanding how people are getting hurt, how males are getting hurt, which is a little bit different from how females get hurt. But that information, it serves as an input to what needs to be considered when you're developing a standard. And I'll tell you, one of the best examples I can give you when it comes to our portfolio is with our life jacket standards. We have a diverse portfolio, so we've got everything from lithium-ion batteries to electric vehicles to wiring cable to life jackets. And so we are a standards development organization that develops standards for accredited test labs to certify products on behalf of the United States Coast Guard. So the standards we develop are very important. When it comes to drowning in the United States and even in parts of Latin America, most people drown not because they wore a PFD, but because they didn't. So we had to start looking at the data and understand why are people not wearing their life jacket. And if you are a boater or you love to go to the lake, if you've ever seen like the life jackets from 20 years ago, they look totally different than they do now. And a big reason why is because manufacturers are trying to influence the way that people, are attracted to life jackets. Is it colors? Kids don't like them because they're not as comfortable. Women also don't like them because they're not as comfortable. But we've done things like incorporate new materials. So you don't always see a woven fabric, for example. You may have a fabric laminated foam or a neoprene because it's breathable. It's also just as durable and has the technical strength that's, needed to hold up in the elements, and not just outdoors, but indoors as well when it's susceptible to different products and different interactions with people. So we had to consider all those things. And one of the inputs that went into our standard, for example, is, okay, now that there are new materials being integrated, how do we make sure this device is still safe? Because we don't want to fix one problem and create another problem. So that's the kind of thought process that we take with these inputs, is making sure that when we can look at the data and see how people are getting hurt, that we can address that with the requirements in the standard.
Yeah, I think that's so smart, and it's truly a way how innovation is changing, how we will make sure that the world is going to be safe for all of us, not just our male counterparts that have written standards in the past. I really believe that through our work in mentoring and bringing up the next generation of STEM engineers and future rocket scientists, we'll really see them change the world. And I'm already seeing changes. I mean, the fact that we are here together and that we're seeing more women join our technical standards committees, our voices are being heard more. So it's so very important. And to all the women entrepreneurs that are out there that are running their own businesses, your voice counts. Make sure that you're there writing those standards. If you need help, we'll help you. I believe every lady on this panel would help you.
Go ahead.
And if I can add just really quickly, we talked a lot about testing requirements and standards, and for those that aren't familiar with what's included in a standard, that standard is very technical. Sometimes it can be a very boring document because it's that technical. And so, again, without the right input, that standard could be irrelevant, and that's what we don't want. And we talked about, as a panel, before we came out today, the implications to not having the right content in a standard. And not having the right voices at the table to ensure that standard is adequate is a barrier and a gap. And another example that I'd like to share is this testing equipment that's used in a lot of different standards, not just UL standards, but also standards for structural firefighting equipment, standards for other wearable devices, and that's a head form. This ISO head form is based on male anatomy. And so we use that head form to conduct testing for the hoods that firefighters wear. Well, guess what? That head form doesn't have hair. That head form is, duplicating the anatomy of a male, and we know that more females are now being introduced to the fire service. So that serves now as an input. Can we change the head form? I would like to say yes, but over time it's been a slow process, and that process has been slow because we need more data. We also need more safety science to help us understand, what is now going to be the substitution, because we can't just, again, fix one problem and create another. Is the head form truly relevant? So we have to study all these things, and it is a complicated process. But we have to study all these things to truly ensure that the way that we deploy diversity is adequate.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. I think it's really important to highlight a couple of the elements of this discussion. And one of the pieces that I've heard over and over again is around our voices and getting more diverse voices to that table of standards development and STEM careers. And so one of the things I'd like us to close on here is what are some of the critical personality traits that are elevating in your voices. And I did not prepare my panelists for this question, so I will first share one of my experiences with all of you. So being at a standards development table, and often as a female engineer, I bring in a different perspective, and sometimes I like to say good morning. And not everyone at the engineering tables loves to say good morning. And so by being out extroverted and approaching people with a charismatic personality isn't always welcome, but I think we definitely need good mornings at a standard table. So I'd like for each of you to just share a thought you have around personality trait that may have been a critical element to your success in STEM.
So I think a lot of times we encourage girls to be pleasant, to be kind, to be nice, to make friends, right? And that can be a good thing and a bad thing, but I think I've tried to use that to my advantage with the networking, with building strong relationships with everyone on the technical committee, and with building trust and respect.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I also agree with you that we need to maybe work harder at the types of language that we use with our daughters and our sons. So rather than tell our daughters they're so beautiful, they're a princess, we can say, you're a genius. You are the smartest woman I know, right? We can foster those sparks. I spoke about sharing a situation with a relative that at a very young age, she had an interest in science, and I was thrilled. So I bought her flashcards for physics at 3, and I'm excited that she's excited, right? So we need to do more of that.
Excellent.
And I think as far as like skill sets and personalities, one of the things that I love to encourage is more of like a systems to thinking approach. And so as someone who is, probably the only one in the room with the background that I have, it's important for me to make sure that my voice is heard, but the voices of everyone at the table, that their voices are heard. And so systems 2 thinking is all about being holistic. Systems 1 says, that's our gut reaction. But systems 2 is, what do we think deep down? Let's not scratch the surface. And I think that's the approach that's important in standards development, because it's truly holistic and it allows us to address a plethora of different things.
We have a future leader in our standard system right here.
Yes. Oh, this is fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies, for your thoughtful comments and perspective. And here's to increasing the voices of diversity and diversity of thought at our standards tables. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.